Good morning. I just got back from 2 weeks lovely vacation to find a different place than when I left. I actually was in Eastern Europe for about 10 days, and you don't get a whole lot of U.S. news over there. I get back, and I get back, and it's like what I thought couldn't get any worse. Just got worse. Thankfully, we only have about, a little over 3 weeks left. There are some good news out of this, but it's not going to be a pretty 3 weeks. And then many of you are connected to not just our nation's politics, but even our global church's politics. A couple of weeks changes a lot of stuff. And wow is all I got to say. So I wasn't planning on talking about this today, but I figured, you know what? It is in everybody's mind. And let's start off. Let me just ask you some questions. How many of you have been just thrilled? I want you honest. How many have been thrilled with this whole political process? How many of you are just so over it? Anybody else out there just over it? All right. Now I'm going to ask you a couple other questions. Let me just kind of, and I'm not going to be too political today, but just how many of you have already decided who you're voting for? Raise your hand nice and loud. All right. Quite a few. Now I'm going to ask the next one, but those of you that just raised your hand, when I ask the next question, you see people raise their hand, do not, I repeat, do not look them up afterwards and say, oh, all right? But how many of you have not made up your mind yet? All right, a handful. And again, do not leave them alone, all right? But let me ask you another maybe more important question. How many of you are just embarrassed? And not only am I embarrassed, I'm worried. I'm worried not just for November 8th, I'm more worried of November 9th, 10th, and 11th, January, whatever date in January, And here's the crazy thing, and I'm guessing you have probably had the same response I have had on some kind of social media or on one of the talking heads on the news as they've made some arguments for their particular candidate, and you thought to yourself, how can somebody in their right mind support him or her, I'm trying to cover all the major options out there. Have you kind of felt that way? I mean, just like, you just get, and sometimes you wish you could just take a match and blow the whole thing up and start over, hit start. But that's not apparently an option for us. And so today, even if you're a believer, I want to talk directly to you today, because I think there's something that you and I, as followers of Jesus, if that's where you consider yourself today, there's something that we can do. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, I hope that what I share today, even if you don't kind of believe the whole Jesus thing, that at least maybe you'll recognize there is maybe a little bit of wisdom in an alternate approach on how we do some things. Because the times in which we live are scary. They're scary for our kids. I talked to some kids this week, my kids and some other people's kids, and they're just trying to make sense out of all the above that I mentioned, out there and even a little bit closer to home. Not only does it scare our kids, it scares those of us that used to be kids. And at some place, we got to come back and get our focus on the only one that has ever gotten his people through things. So before we jump in today, we're going to actually start off in a passage that I want to kind of set a stage for an event from Jesus' life that may kind of surprise you, especially in light of what we've just talked about, in light of our world. But before we go there, I invite you to bow your heads and let's pray one more time together today, all right? Father, my simple one-word prayer today is help. Help me. Help us. Help all of us. To consider your greatness, your ways, to consider what you said was the greatest guides and rules of our lives. To inwardly love you with everything we have. To give you our all. And in turn, to treat our neighbors, to treat those around us with respect, with honor, and with care. So help us, because that is not easy, especially with some of the stupid things people believe. So I ask you to be with us today and remind us again of the story that you decided should have been recorded and kept for us, to help us to rethink and to refocus and to take another step in following you. So use this time now for your sake, in your name. Amen. If you've got a Bible and you want to follow along, or you got it on your app on something, I'm going to start real briefly over in Mark chapter 3, and let me give you just a little bit of background. Mark, as he records this story, is remind us of the day when Jesus called his 12 disciples, his 12 followers, his very specific guys that were going to lead this whole thing. And if you go back and read it, he goes up on this mountain. He gets all these people together, and then he begins to pick these 12. And he says he picks them for three reasons. He picks them so that they'll be with him, that this idea of a rabbi, we don't really understand it today, but in the Jewish culture, you had a rabbi. This was a person they felt was an important teacher, and he would get sort of apprentices that would fall underneath him and would spend all this time and would basically live with him to learn what he was about, what he talked about, what he taught, and to sort of absorb that and then to share that. So Jesus said, I'm going to ask these 12 to come, and the first thing is to be with me. Secondly is to go preach the kingdom, the idea that God was doing something and that the kingdom had come now. And lastly, he was going to give them some power. It says power to cast out demons and evil. So it was going to be sort of an assignment, but also this power. And then he goes through the list of the people he calls. And if you haven't read it, you ought to go through and look at Mark chapter 3, because it's an interesting list of 12 guys. You got a guy in there that's a zealot, which we would call today a terrorist, because he was about attacking the government that had formed, the Roman government, and trying to get it back for the Jews. And so one of Jesus' 12 guys is a terrorist. Another of his 12 is a tax collector, and nobody liked tax collectors. We don't like them today, but back then they really didn't like them, right? In fact, tax collectors didn't like each other. Because if I was a tax collector and you were a tax collector, you might be taking some of my money because I could take it if you weren't there, So they were these, but one of his guys is a tax collector. He's got a couple of sets of brothers. He's got a number of fishermen, and part of those fishermen are these two guys named James and John. And so in this list of the 12 he calls, he gets to James and John, Mark does, and he says, and he also called James and John the sons of Zebedee. And then he adds this little reminder of how Jesus talked about them. Now this is where it says that Jesus said this. Jesus named them, these two brothers, James and John, Boanerges, which means, everybody say it with me, sons of thunder, right? Now, how would you like to be one of Jesus' disciples? And he looks at you and says, your name is this, but by the way, you are a son or you are a daughter of thunder. Now, it's interesting. If you go look at some commentaries on this, scholars that look at this, there are some that believe this meant they were powerful preachers. Which is pretty hard to figure out when the word actually means tumult or kind of riot. These guys weren't powerful preachers. Jesus didn't say you guys are powerful preachers. That's right. These guys were trouble, all right? These guys were two fishermen. They were two brothers. And how many of you come from two brother families? If you come from two brother families, you know what I'm talking about, right? Brothers, they're always battling, right? There's this thing between them, this competition. And in this set, Jesus gets these guys and he calls them sons of thunders, which I think is kind of a cool thing. I mean, I wonder if they went out and got those, those little, jean jest and put on the back, sons of thunder, if that was kind of their thing as they did this, be kind of a cool idea. Hey, Jesus calls us this, But it kind of gives you an insight into these guys named James and John, these two brothers, that they were apparently a little bit of a trouble, all right? That's important to know as we get to the main story I want us to look at, which is found over in Luke chapter 9. And Luke begins this by saying, hey, this is towards the end. So the first part we just looked at was at the start of Jesus' ministry. So about 3.5 years later, Luke catches us up with the story and says, now when the time was coming near for Jesus to depart, that is ascend, that he's going to go back to heaven, that Jesus had cleared in his mind that this was it. And in fact, it says, he had decided and knew what was going on. They had set their course for Jerusalem. That's where they were heading because Jesus talked about that. When he gets there, it's going to go really bad. That he's going to die there. In fact, he tells his disciples, they have a hard time understanding that. But he tells them over and over, this is what's going to happen. So Luke says, this is that time. It's a time coming near that Jesus is going to depart, that he's going to ascend, that he's going to leave this planet. And he says as they were doing that, they come to this place. And as they come to this village, Jesus is who this time about when he says he sent some messengers ahead of him who went into a town in Samaria to make everything ready for him. Now, if you're not familiar with Samaria, let me give you just a little background. Samaria was in another sort of country, another nation that was right by the Jewish nation. And Jews and Samaritans did not get along. They are like our current Republicans and Democrats, all right? Or any other versions you want to put in there, because we all have those versions, right? All of us have us, and we all have them, right? And all of us know who them are. This is who them are. They were Samaritans then, all right? So Jesus and the guys are going along. They're coming to this village. Jesus says, hey, guys, go up there. Get some things set up for us when we get there so we got a place to stay, all this kind of stuff. And it's a Samaritan town, all right? So somebody apparently goes. But when they get there, it says, but the people there would not welcome him. That is, they wouldn't welcome Jesus. And here's the reason why. Because he was heading towards Jerusalem. Because they believed Jerusalem was not the holy place to go to. They had their own mountain over here. That was the place to go to. And anybody who was going for that reason, they didn't want everything to do with. Which I have to wonder, the guys that went, or some of the disciples had to go, what does it matter with these people? Don't they know who Jesus is? I mean, come on, Jesus is coming to town. Have you heard stories, I'm sure. Why aren't you going to open up your town for it? I mean, how could somebody believe like that? How could somebody deny somebody that just simply were going that? To which James and John entered the story. When James and John, who were the sons of, and also followers, disciples of Jesus, saw this, they said the following, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven and destroy that is burned up, consume those people? Jesus, do you want us to call a lightning bolt down and incinerate the bunch, right? You ever feel like that? I mean, especially in this whole, let's face it, I've seen all the social media tweets that I want to see and information and stuff to convince people of where they're at in this whole voting thing. I've seen the responses. How could an honest, person with half a brain cell believe this stuff? I've seen all the kind of responses. I've seen all the incendiary stuff coming down from the very candidates themselves all the way down to their supporters. Do you want us to get in there and blow the thing up? To which Jesus says, we don't know what he said. But Luke actually records, and he says, Jesus did two things. He turned, which meant they were going to get his full attention. This wasn't just Jesus said in passing, stop. He said, this is something he turned, so it tells us he's going to take an action. He turns to them, and it says that he scolded, that is, he rebuked them. Luke is silent on what those words were, so we have no idea what they were. I don't know whether it was you bunch of idiots. I don't kind of picture that for Jesus, but you never know. I don't know if he whacked them upside the head, because sometimes sons of thunders need to be whacked upside the head. I don't know whether he just simply said, no, of course not. Who in their right mind, after spending 3.5 years with Jesus, almost 24/7 with Jesus, who in their right mind should come to the conclusion that what Jesus is about burning them? killing them, as opposed to what Jesus is saying, no, this is not about wiping them out. This is about me saving them. Haven't you guys been listening at this time? The Son of Man came to save people. You don't save people by frying their behinds, right? But I think it's such an interesting insight. You have these two guys that Jesus handpicks. These sons of thunder, these sons of tumult. These guys that were trouble. And when somebody sort of steps on their toes, they want to go all nuclear on them. True? I'm going to be honest. Have you ever had your zeal sort of just blind you to a situation? Have you ever gotten so mad about something? So mad about how stupid somebody's argument is, how unbelievable that somebody could actually support this candidate, how somebody could, with all the history, have you ever let your zeal sort of blind you to the bigger and the more important? Because for James and John that day, they did. Because they were Jesus' boys. And they were ready to call down fire, Jesus, to straighten these people out that won't even let you come into their town. And I love how Luke finishes the story. He doesn't tell us what Jesus said. He just says he turns and he scolds them, he rebukes them, and then notice how he finishes the story. Oh, wait, before I get there. I think Jesus' point is simply this, that when we win at all cost, we discount the cost of winning. Somebody's going to win at all cost. And the problem for our national candidates is, at least the two main parties, we already have the two candidates in the history of presidential elections that have the lowest likability rates of anybody in history. We have candidates supported not because people like that candidate, but because never elect, thankfully everybody's silent, never elect, him or her, whatever version you want to go down through that list, right? And the cost of winning, we had a decision in our global church situation about winning at all cost. And the problem of winning at all cost is we discount the cost of winning, what it does to people's lives. In fact, when we win at all cost, I'm convinced that when it's all said and done, nobody wins. Especially from a faith perspective. Especially from a faith perspective. So let me get back to Luke. Here's how Luke summarizes the story, Caesar. I knew you were waiting for that. Here we go. Wouldn't you have loved to have been there that day? Because I would have loved to hear what Jesus said to these boys, right? Luke doesn't tell us. And maybe that's simply what it was, that Jesus turned and said, of course not. Knock it off. And they went to another town. Jesus didn't let him bother him because, and I have to imagine Jesus was struggling with this. After 3.5 years, his guys hadn't all got this yet, but because Jesus is all about this idea of spreading good. Why don't you incinerate him? Because that's not my goal. I have something bigger in mind than just simply wiping out my opponents. So let me ask you a question. How does good spread? First way is this. Yeah, heavy stuff, right? Somebody's going, mind blown, right? But sometimes those honestly, the deepest things are the simplest things. I mean, how do you get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? You gotta have bread, you gotta have peanut butter, and some kind of jelly, strawberry, grape, blackberry, boysenberry, whatever berry you like, right? But is that a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? No, because somebody's got to, that's right, you got to spread it, right? Because if you don't, it's just peanut butter, jelly, and some bread. But somebody got to spread it, right? And the only way that good will spread is when good is spread. And you know who Jesus is asked to spread that good? Raise your right hand and repeat after me. Me. All right, that's what it was, right? And that's the thing we need to keep in mind. And that's the thing I'm going to ask you to do today, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it next week, but the day before November 8th, and especially after November 8th, is to put your faith before your political beliefs, your strong convictions, your how could anybody support them? Because your job is not to get somebody elected or to keep somebody from getting elected. Your job, if you are a follower of Jesus, is to spread good. And the only way you spread good is by, because the reality is anger is contagious, isn't it? You ever been in a group? You knew it was going to have a little bit of heat, and all of a sudden everybody got worked up, and you kind of got worked up too, because everybody got worked up. Especially when that other person got up and said something stupid, it just got everybody really worked up, right? I mean, anger is contagious, right? Hate's contagious too, right? I mean, nobody is born hating somebody. They get infected at some place, right? Your parents, your neighbors, your friends. And the crazy thing is fear. Fear is contagious too. And we got a whole lot of contagious fear going on right now, don't we? A lot of fear going on. But here's the crazy thing. While hate and fear are contagious as well, so are hope and love. They are. When people want to have something to hope in, you give them a little bit of rope, and they will run with it a long ways. Just something to give them some hope, because we want to have hope. And love is contagious. But here's the problem with hope and love. Right? I mean, it's easy to hate. It's easy to be fearful, to be angry. Love takes some work. That's why it's important for us to remember that if I'm going to call myself a follower of Jesus, then I have to be a follower of Jesus. And I have to follow where he leads. There's another way good spreads. And it spreads by us showing up and being a light, not a flamethrower. That is the takeaway from James and John's situation, right? Because they were glad to be a flamethrower for Jesus. Call it down and fry them, Lord, right? To which Jesus said, no. You just got to be a light and just show up. Don't get all caught up in the other stuff. Because here's the thing we all need to come to grips with. Your political views make perfect sense to you, right? Your behaviors make perfect sense to you. If I asked you why you do that, Joanne, you'd say, well, this is why I did that. I'd go, okay, now it makes sense, right? We need to recognize that your political views make perfect sense to you. But here's where the trouble comes. Everybody's political views make sense to them, right? It doesn't make perfect sense, but it makes sense to them, right? And we forget that sometimes. Because we see what some other people believe, and it's so different from what we believe, and we say, how could anybody in their right mind believe that? I mean, how could somebody really believe that? I wouldn't call them an idiot, but I might say that's an idiotic thought process. because I would never call somebody an idiot, But it's important to recognize that just as our political views, our behaviors, our beliefs, all of our stuff makes perfect sense to us, the other person, their stuff makes, if not perfect sense, at least it makes sense to them. And so here's the point from all this. When you don't know how someone could do such a thing, when you don't know how somebody could believe such a thing, how somebody could support someone like that, how could somebody be voting this way in spite of all the clear evidence and the just stuff that hits you in the face of why you should never support something like that, when you don't know how someone could do such a thing, believe such a thing, act in such a way, support such a thing, you need to know something. There's something you don't know. And that is, you don't know what led them to that belief. Because just like your belief makes perfect sense to you, their belief makes perfect sense to them. That's why you need to show up. And simply be a light, not a flamethrower. In fact, let me ask you a question. A little honesty here. Hopefully nobody else is in the room that you've done this to, but how many of you have unfriended or blocked somebody on social media through this political process? Thank you for your honesty. Right? And some of you did it because you said to yourself, I could never be friends with somebody who believed that way, acted the way, supported that kind of thing, right? And the question has to be for those of us who consider ourselves followers of Jesus. Is somebody's very personal held views, to which they have a reason to believe according to them, which makes perfect sense to them. Is that worth cutting them out of your life? And cutting off the potential of what that friendship could do and maybe has been for your life? See, I'm asking all of us, not just between now and November 8th, but especially November 9th and 10th and January 1st and next July and whatever date you pick in the next few years. I'm asking all of us to recognize the need to put our faith at the top of our processing system as opposed to our political beliefs or our personal convictions over how inappropriate somebody is. Because I think there's something greater at stake. And it's something that's greater at stake for our nation. Let's be honest. Whoever wins this election will not have the support of the majority of the United States. Two candidates. I mean, I'm not talking about the other two particular candidates because but let me talk about all four of them. To be fair, him, her, all right? None of the him, hers are going to have the support of the majority of the United States, and a couple of the him, hers are going to have some very strong dislike to whoever gets there. And our nation has to survive this election. And I'm not telling you how to vote, be clear on that. I'm not telling you can't have an opinion. I'm just telling you, be careful about how you express that opinion. Because what if there's something greater at stake than simply who's going to lead this nation? Because, oh, by the way, there is a God who sits in heaven who is still in control. In spite of how it may look. In spite of the options as we've been presented with. Because, oh, by the way, this place here, as much as you may like your home, and that really nice chair that you get to sit in every night that's so comfortable, you finally got it just so comfortable for you. And all the stuff that you finally got finished at your house. None of that, if you're a follower of Jesus, is your home. This place, as we now understand it, is not where we're ending up. So we need to be careful as followers of Jesus to follow him. Let me go to one more, how good spreads. And that is, to get this right, we must do what Jesus did, which is hard for us. Because at times we like James and John's approach. Hit the button and no longer a friend. Take that, you know. How you like me now? All right, yeah, all right. Tell everybody else, you know, I can't stand this. I have blocked a bunch of, and if you don't like it, tell me, because I'll take you off my list too. And here's Jesus, who handpicks a group of guys that if you're picking the best 12, you're probably not picking. Who some have said probably the most competent of the group is the guy that ends up at the end selling Jesus out. You got loud guys. You got these fishermen that have fished for years. So you got to listen to all their fish stories about how big the fish were, and you know they weren't that big, but you got to listen to them. They probably still smell a little bit like fish, because you fish around fish for enough years, you're going to smell like fish all the time. A tax collector that you hang around with, there's a great thing to tell all your friends. Oh yeah, hey, one of the guys we hang around with, tax collector, you know. Woo-hoo. Got your zealot. You got your brothers and all their kind of fighting position that goes on there. And what did Jesus do with this group of guys? He kept them as his friends to the bitter end. Knowing they were going to give him up, knowing that some would deny him, knowing that one of them would be instrumental in bringing about his death. And that's important for us to remember. When we're faced with the the craziness, the loss of civility and respect that we no longer have. Listen, your hard edges, and we all have hard edges, especially when it comes to politics, but your hard edges only make it harder for you to fulfill your purpose to live out God's kingdom wherever you are. Just thought I'd throw that part in, all right? So let me wind up. Let me share just a couple of quotes. We verify our faith by the way we treat other people. You didn't like that one? I wasn't looking necessarily for that. I just wanted to know if you liked it or not. Because that's true, isn't it? I mean, that's what Jesus said. So if you're going to kind of buy what Jesus said was true, that you got to kind of buy this. That's how we kind of show, we verify, we validate. That's how we live out this thing we call faith. That's why Jesus said 2 parts to the greatest commandment, not just one. To love God with everything, and everybody said, oh yeah, let's just do that one. Because I don't like my neighbor, but just let me love you, Jesus. You said, that'd be great, but actually there's 2 parts, guys. It's got to love them with everything, and that love comes out in treating your neighbors like yourself, with some respect, some civility, some appreciation, some acceptance that their beliefs about things make perfect sense to them, just like yours make perfect sense to you. Another quote. Reasonable fear calls for unreasonable faith. And the reality is, we have reasonable fear as a nation. And I would even say we have reasonable fear as this particular church. And in times of reasonable fear of what's going to happen, what if, we don't know, this could go bad or it could go really bad, doesn't look like there's any way to really go good. And in the face of unreasonable fear, we need to have unreasonable faith. And we're going to talk more about that next week. Faith that will not necessarily make sense to somebody else. But it will not only make sense to us, it'll be the evidence that we have put our hopes in something greater than any kind of structure that we have or will create down here. So let me ask you a couple questions as we wind this thing up. My question before you leave today is simply this: will you spread good? Will you? We not just let the peanut butter and the jelly be just piled there. We actually get in and begin to spread good. And will you put your faith before your politics? Because I want you to listen to me on this. Because Democrat or Republican, Libertarian or Independent or Green or whatever parties out there, conservative or liberal, all are precious in His sight. Because Jesus loved the little children of the world. And our question is, will we? So I hope you think about that this week as you leave. And in fact, I invite you to take out that Connect card that I talked about earlier. And every week we like to give you sort of a chance to sort of take another step spiritually in your faith journey. So let me just ask some questions. And again, we're going to come back next week and talk a little more about this unreasonable faith aspect of this. But maybe your next step today is to simply to rethink your angst, your fear, your frustration, your emotions in light of Jesus' approach. In light of the way He told James and John just to kind of calm down. Maybe your next step today is to consider the cost of winning at all cost. To kind of look at it a little bit broader. Maybe your next step today is to overcome evil with good, even in your own life. That would have been what I would have checked, but I didn't have my paper with me today. Because there are times when I would love to blow things up. And folks, this is not about not having an opinion. You ought to have an opinion. This is not voting for whoever you feel moved to vote for. This is simply asking you to temper your to tell somebody else how stupid, idiotic, crazy, foolish, how could you ever do that? And to recognize we have a bigger and greater goal as followers of Jesus.